From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Ben Badafarano. Thank you for joining us. Our guests today are Dr. Erin Kearns, NCITE Director of Law Enforcement Partnerships, Dr. Adam Ghazi-Tehrani, who is an Associate Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Indiana University. Dr. Tehrani is visiting Omaha this week to collaborate with Dr. Kearns on a series of papers examining the similarities and differences in 1, the scholarship on, 2, the public conceptualization of, and 3, the public attitudes toward punishment for terrorism, hate crimes, and other forms of mass violence. And we'll be discussing those today. Erin, Adam, thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, appreciate you being here. I wanted to talk to you guys just to kind of give a general sense. Can you give me the premise of how you got interested in these specific topics, how you guys found each other, and then how it manifested in these papers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Adam and I met nearly a decade ago, which feels weird to think about, when we were both at the University of Alabama. And I think that sort of the genesis of this is I studied terrorism, obviously. Adam teaches class on hate crimes. And just sort of discussing the incident that sticks out to me was the yoga studio shooting in, I think it was Tallahassee, that happened during that time that we were at Alabama. And sort of it was the beginning of a lot of the public discourse around incels, discussion of like, is this, terrorism? It feels like a hate crime. It's mass violence. Like, how do we conceptualize this? And honestly, I think a lot of it was just us like texting news articles and kind of ranting at each other a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, because at that point, I think we'd already had Alec Manassian as well, and then Elliot Rodger before that. And so like the incel discussion had kind of begun, but it wasn't in the public sphere yet. And I do feel like that was the beginning. Like I remember a Washington Post article specifically talking about the like lack of female attention or something, like the way they phrased it was creepy. But, so we kind of were discussing along those lines, like how come when we have these things that, are in this realm, we talk about them differently based on, seemingly random factors.
Yeah. And that's something that I think everyone has trouble with is discerning what are hate crimes, what is terrorism, because in a lot of ways, depending on how the media covers it, or how just like your friends are talking about it, that's how you perceive of it. And then that you catalog that in your head and slowly you build up this understanding of what it is, even though, experts or researchers might have a totally different conception, a very focused conception of what that is. So can you guys like define, if you can, roughly what you would lump into each of those categories?
Sure. I mean, so in terms of defining terrorism, like I think many of the particularly quantitative scholars of terrorism tend to use the Global Terrorism Database's definition of terrorism because that is the most sort of, all-encompassing publicly available data set. So it's looking at the threat or use of violence to intimidate, coerce, or induce fear. It has to have a social, political, economic, or religious motivation. There's a couple of other sort of more niche parts of that definition as well, but really looking at this from the academic definition, because when you look at it from a legal definition, there, even within the United States, different federal agencies are going to define terrorism differently. And then that gets much more complicated as you go out from country to country.
Yeah, and for hate crime, hate is actually not the right word anymore. So we tend to refer to them as bias crimes because the word hate makes you believe that there should be an element of malice, and that's not necessarily true. So for a hate crime to occur, it has to be against a protected class, which goes both ways, right? So people tend to think of it as minority, but it can go the other way too. So there can be a hate crime against the majority. But something like targeting a person in a wheelchair, you might not hate them, but you're still targeting them for being in a wheelchair, right? So that's a bias crime, right? So it fits under that same umbrella, right? You're doing something to someone in a protected class because they're in that protected class. And so historically, we've thought of, bigoted crimes, but then again, you have ones that aren't necessarily like that same level of hate, but you're still targeting people for that.
And I think hate, it has a very personal connotation,
Right?
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Bias crimes. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
But again, I mean, even in the laws, like we were saying, it's written hate crime a lot of the time. So like, again, we're caught in this weird thing where there's scholarly definitions, there's legal definitions, there's the public conception, and that's kind of what our first paper was looking at, and now some of these other ones as well.
When you have so many different definitions running around all over the place, and then also in the popular news media, what like public misconceptions frustrate you when you're interacting with quote unquote like non-experts? Like what kind of things pop out to you?
I mean, there's kind of a list, Ben. No, I think that a couple of the biggest misconceptions are about, how frequent terrorism is. I think that there is, and I've done this in research, asked members of the public to estimate how many terrorist attacks there have been in the United States over the prior decade, how many people have died in terrorist attacks. And people tend to drastically overestimate the prevalence of something that is really a fairly rare occurrence. And beyond that, there's the misperceptions about what is terrorism and what is not. And this has been part of public discourse about how the perpetrators race, ethnicity can impact people's perceptions of whether something's terrorism or not. There's plenty of research that's been done on this where, if the perpetrator is Muslim from somewhere in the Middle East, Arab, there's a tendency to be more likely to ascribe the terrorism label, both amongst the public as well as in news media.
When you think of a historical primer, then when you think of like terrorism, like start date historically, I know that's a very broad question.
Yeah.
I know that's a very broad question. Just as a primer, like when you think of specifically think of non-state terrorism, sure. In the public consciousness, if we have like a timeline graph, where do you see that, like at least in the last 100 years? Are there intervals?
Let's limit to the last 100 years. It's like we can go back millennia, sure. But in the last 100 years, and this is something that comes largely, from Rappaport's work on the 4 waves of modern terrorism.
Who is it?
Rappaport. And looking at sort of the 4 waves of modern terrorism, where the first wave, which was late 1800s into early 1900s, is really more of an anarchist wave of violence that moved into, and I forget the exact terminology, which I shouldn't because I just finished revising a paper about this, but moving into more of a I don't remember the next wave's name, but more sort of a little bit more of the state violence post World War II, then going into, anti-colonial violence. And then from the Iranian Revolution onward, looking at more this, religious wave of modern terrorism.
Okay, that's interesting. And do you sketch any of that in the papers that you've been looking at? Like a historical sense of how people conceive of?
No, we haven't in these papers, I think largely because that's more of the academics take a lens on it. I don't think that if you asked the general public that they would have that same conceptualization. For most people, particularly in the United States, I mean, pre 9/11, people kind of didn't think that terrorism really happened here, even though we had Oklahoma City bombing, less than a decade prior to it. It's just something that I think is not sort of as rooted in the public consciousness.
That's interesting because going back to something you said just previously, how it has like an inflated sense of like how common it is. How do events affect that? So like when you think of Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, right? It honestly, this is a terrible comparison, but I think of like shark attacks. Sure. You know how like they're actually extremely rare.
No, I don't actually think that that's a terrible comparison at all.
Okay, great. That makes me feel better. We won't have to cut this out.
Yeah, I don't think it is a terrible comparison because it's something that is incredibly rare. The number of fatalities in the United States per year is very low. When I say very low, I mean, this is going to vary from year to year. Of course, I'm not talking about 9/11, but it's somewhere in the 10 to 20 range. And I'm not trying to trivialize this, but when you think about how many people die in car accidents every single day, comparably, it is quite different.
When you compare it to more like familiar crimes, when you compare terrorism to more familiar crimes, like murder, theft, how do people feel that terrorism is like a step beyond those common crimes? And then for each of those, like terrorism, bias crimes, and other forms of mass violence, like how do those step beyond in the public conception? How do those step beyond like a regular or like even white collar crime?
Yeah, so I think part of it is most traditional crime or street crime, white collar crime, whatever, non-bias or terrorist crime, we tend to think of them as like unique events produced by those circumstances, right? The situation the person was in, the defender, the victim, whatever. The goal of a lot of terrorism or hate crime is to kind of send a message to a larger community, right? So, LGBT community or, a minority community or whatever. I think that is one of the key differences, right? So you are perceiving it not as that unique situation, but something that happens to people that are similar to you, right? So if you are part of that group, now, when I go out, am I going to be attacked for being gay or brown or whatever, where you're not really thinking that in the same way as like theft, right? It's, I don't know, I'm going to protect my wallet, right? I don't go down that alley, right? Like there's more you can do to avoid street crime where it feels like the terrorism and the hate crime are more of like something that happens to you regardless of your choices. And I think that sticks with people.
When you think of like other forms of mass violence, what other things are you looking at? I'm a person who minored in Holocaust and genocide studies, right? So for me, I'm always curious, like, is genocide included in there? Is like, what kind of forms of mass violence are you thinking of?
Well, and this is what really, I think, an interesting and important question as we were revising as part of our paper yesterday. Like, we think about mass violence. No, we're not going as far as to think about these sort of widespread systemic things like genocide. Thinking more about this in terms of, and how this came about in our early discussions was things like, that were largely mass shootings, and that's a largely U.S. focused problem. But by, if we've said mass shooting, that is then dictating what the weapon has to be. And you have attacks that are, in other countries in particular, that are knife or sword attacks, vehicle rammings, things that are also part of this discussion, where the public discourse might be more like, this person was, had a mental illness or something along those lines, but they can also fit into being hate crimes. That could also fit into being terrorism or some overlap thereof.
We touched a little bit on, the public media, the news media, right? Controlling kind of that narrative to some extent, or at least influencing it strongly. What other controls or factors come in to like shape that narrative? Besides, like, because I think you can think of leaders, right? Like state leaders, obviously the non-state leaders of like terrorist organizations. But I'm just curious, what do you look at for those controls?
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly about the control. It's more, it's difficult to sort of map out what are all of the things that are influencing people's perceptions. Certainly news media consumption, things that you can't really necessarily measure in such a clear way, but social media consumption, the discussions that you're having with your friends, your family, as Adam mentioned earlier, like that can have an influence on how people are perceiving particular events. One of the things that I think was really surprising in some of my past work on media coverage of terrorism, some of our work together on media coverage of terrorism and hate crimes, is that there are many incidents that should be classified as terrorism that don't really get much, if any, national media coverage. So people are just fully unaware that they ever happened. Whereas there are, other incidents that dominate the news cycle, and we can, name these events, the people who perpetrated them, all of that.
Got it. Okay.
And I think part of it is like enough of the zeitgeist treats the events differently that I think that we do it by default. So I'll give you an example. If there is an attack that is motivated in some way by Islam, it's treated kind of monolithically as coming from Islamic terrorism, like writ large, right? Where if there's a similar attack, right, like let's say incel, they're not linked together in the same way, right? It's kind of like lone wolf incels, but the ideology is shared in the same way. And I'm not arguing that like they should be treated like a monolith, but more of like we in the discourse treat them differently. And I think that affects how we think about them too. And so like our natural inclination is to look at someone like an Elliot Rodger and go like, what went wrong in his specific life? Where then when we have what we would qualify as terrorism, it's less of like about the individual, more about the ideology that they belong to. Right.
The broader influence.
And so like, I think that sometimes that's correct, but sometimes I think that, that path gets taken and then it's too hard to kind of go the other way. And I do think that there are patterns that have emerged. who's behind that or what's going on. I don't know, but it's interesting. I think to go back to one of the earlier questions of like the public perception of or like awareness of terrorism, and I think it matters like where we're talking about. So like in the U.S. for sure, 9/11. But if you go earlier, right, think of the UK and Ireland, right? Like they were much more aware of terrorism before 9/11, right?
Yeah, the Troubles.
Exactly. And so like I think that even that, right? Like the Brits call it terrorism. I don't know if the Irish do, right? Like there's like this kind of thing where it's like the people who are pushing the narrative get to kind of name it, and then the rest of us kind of get like myself, it's like when I see stuff, it's like I go like what happened to that guy, and it's like I know that that's not something I apply equally.
Yeah,
which is unfortunate.
And that's also hard, I imagine. Some of the research that we've done at NCITE like looks at how different countries define it and how that totally changes how they enforce it, how they conceptualize how it is, and that presents serious problems when you're trying to collaborate on prevention and things like that. Oh, interesting. I do want to pivot a little bit to like the literature, because one of the things that you guys look at is kind of doing, I assume, an overview of the literature that exists on these exact topics. What does it look like? What does the field look like right now? What makes these papers kind of unique?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that really stuck out to me when we started having these conversations nearly a decade ago, was that, within the terrorism literature, which is much where I'm immersed, there's not really much overlap with the hate crimes literature.
Yeah.
And these are two things, within, the American Society of Criminology, we have the Division on Terrorism and Bias Crimes. And despite it being very clearly linked in people's minds within our community, there's really limited, I can think of, there's a handful of articles that have looked at these sort of comparisons, these overlaps, and distinguishing, elements between terrorism and hate crimes, because there are many incidents that would reasonably be classified as both.
Can you give me an example of one of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about something that's classified as terrorism and a hate crime, so something like the Christchurch shooting, right, mm-hmm. where it is terrorism, but it is also targeting a mosque, therefore hate crime.
Right.
And there are myriad examples of this. Where you see these incidents that qualify as both. There's, of course, things that would just be a hate crime, would just be terrorism as well.
Got it. Okay.
But these literatures really don't speak to each other in a way that is, I think, problematic and, to expanding our understanding of violence that does not, doesn't fit into these neat, discrete little categories. We live in a messy world.
A big part of NCITE, as we've said many times before, right, but is preparing practitioners, giving them a lot of the background information that they need, and kind of helping with the conceptualization of these things to help them more on the front lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be very candid that these were projects that started before I was here at NCITE, before I was focusing entirely on applied research. So this is a little bit more of what we call sort of basic science approach to understanding phenomenon in the world. But it is important, I think, in, understanding what is terrorism, hate crimes, et cetera, because so much of the public discourse around this is like, well, did it get charged as? Was there a terrorism enhancement, hate crime enhancement? And that's, left up to prosecutorial discretion. There's, a whole different body of literature about how prosecutors decide whether or not to go for those enhancements. And it's typically going to be in cases where they're pretty certain that they'll meet the threshold.
For like the hate crime angle, right? So if we're talking about like terrorism being more rare than people perceive, I think hate crime is more common than people perceive. And if we're talking about them as kind of like on a continuum, I think that there is kind of a disregard from the police to treat these things the way that they should be treated. And I do think part of that is the end problem of they are very difficult to prosecute as a hate crime, right? So unless the person was screaming slurs or, drawing swastikas or whatever during the crime, a lot of times the prosecutor is just going to go for the easy, provable murder, theft, whatever, right? The enhancement, weapons possession, exactly, like is going to give more time, but it might make your case more difficult to prove, and maybe you lose. And so a lot of times you kind of don't go that angle. And then again, in the media and stuff, it becomes the like, well, then was it a hate crime? And it's like, yeah, but we just couldn't. Like the energy shouldn't have been spent there proving it in court. And so I think that with the interactions I've had with working with officers, I think that when they become more aware, I do think that the policing becomes better. And like, it's kind of counterintuitive because then like the reports of hate crime go up, but that's because they're actually being seen versus being ignored, right? And so
and I'm sure, like, depending on where you are in the country too, like
hugely different.
Yeah, reporting, if they report
rules,
it, then it's
right.
like totally
I mean,
different.
hugely different at the state level, different, different regulations, different training. We were just discussing this yesterday, the California where Adam's from. If you look at reported hate crimes, it's what, like 50%?
It's 20%. So it's a fifth of all of the US, which
Okay.
statistically looks real bad.
Yeah.
But then if you think about it, it's people are more comfortable going to the police thinking that something will actually be done. There are more, minority groups, period, interacting with other groups, right? So like the recipe for it to occur more, but then also to be reported more is much higher. And again, we met in Alabama, and while teaching my class there, like there were a number of counties that reported 0 hate crimes. And it's like that, come on, 0 for a year, come on. So these kinds of things, right? So it's I wouldn't argue that it's like not applicable to like practitioners, but it is kind of like a more, a priori, like,
okay,
think about this the next time
Forming
you're
all
making
of
an
the-
arrest. Yeah. But yeah,
Sure.
we're not trying to like retrain anyone. It's more of a like just, like there are misconceptions, I think, that we all have, like I just alluded to with myself, where I think, there can be improvements made for sure.
Got it. Okay, interesting. I did remember something that I forgot to
Sure.
talk about. So as I told you excitedly, I read a book a while ago called Discipline and Punish by Foucault. Is it Foucault or
Foucault?
Foucault. Sorry, I always mix those up.
It's French.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting in that book was the public, when he was doing like his historical framework of punishment for crimes, and the prison system, there is a strong focus on like the public delight almost for punishment. And, like you picture like a period drama where, you see like a public execution, something like that, right? When you think of that, like, do you think that is as true as it was then? Like, is there a delight for those kind of, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Like, is there something there that still exists that people think that some things should be like punished much more than others?
Oh, yeah.
When you think of degrees and like, okay.
Yes. So I love this question. So, I mean, right. You're thinking about there's a Johnny Cash song about public execution.
Yeah.
There's, Scarlet Letter comes to mind, right? So you have these historical sort of and this is not a uniquely American thing either, but certainly, the idea of going and watching public executions. I mean, I think that there's, I don't know how long, but centuries old history of this. I wish that like you could go back in time and I could do public opinion polls throughout history, of course, right? But barring that, I've seen this in a lot of my work where it's asking about people's, perceived what they think is the appropriate punishment, or what they think is sort of the ability to be rehabilitated across different types of offenses and offenders. And I've looked at this in all sorts, within the context of these papers. We have a project with Callie that's looking at that. Within some of the papers I've worked on with Isaac, another one of our PhD students, look at this, as well as a book I wrote a handful of years ago looking at public support for torture. We're, as a U.S. focused comment, we are a rather punitive country. People, and this is some of the other work looking at public support for torture, where people say, "Oh no, I want to do it because it's sort of this utilitarian justification." But when you really kind of get into it, it's much more punitive.
I'd love to like pick your brains all day. But thank you both for joining us. Our guests today were Dr. Erin Kearns, NCITE Director of Law Enforcement Partnerships, and Dr. Adam Ghazi-Tehrani, who is visiting NCITE from Indiana University to collaborate on some papers. This series is produced by Ben Badafarano, Aaron Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ersch. Thank you for joining us for another episode of NCITE Insights. The National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE, is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking to find out more? Check out our website at incite.unomaha.edu or email us at incite@unomaha.edu.